Sometimes it starts just like this, an evening departure from a scenic airport following a visit to family. Maybe a little later than planned. That's the whole point of owning an airplane. You don't have to fit your schedule to an airline. It's 722 nautical miles from Peter O. Knight Airport in Florida to Sullivan County Airport in Indiana. That's a bit under 5 hours depending on the wind. Ryan's final destination was Lawrenceville Vincennes International Airport, 22 miles south of Sullivan. It's not entirely clear why Ryan made the stop at Sullivan. 100 LL fuel's a little cheaper there. Maybe he was bargain hunting. Sullivan wasn't a normal stop for him. He landed at 1:26 in the morning. He crashed at Lawrenceville at 1:23. The paradox explained by the difference between Eastern and Central time zones. Though the 22-mile flight is mostly south, it crosses the Wabash River, which also divides Illinois from Indiana. So it was that he crashed short of Lawrenceville Airport after he landed in Sullivan, but also 3 minutes before. At 0550 Zulu, 20 minutes prior to departing Sullivan, Ryan obtained a weather briefing from ForeFlight. It reported marginal VFR at Lawrenceville due to her scattered layer at 300 feet. Still, it had 6 miles visibility with an overcast layer at 1,200 feet. AirMet Sierra was active for the area, forecasting IFR conditions at the time of the accident. The temperature was 23 degrees Celsius. The dew point was 22 degrees. Air temperature has a tendency to decrease overnight until around 9 a.m. in the morning. By the time the SR22 was approaching Lawrenceville Airport, the temperature dew point wound up to be the same at 22 degrees. This, of course, means that the air was saturated with moisture. Visibility had deteriorated to 1/2 mile at the ceiling of 200 feet. The minimums for the LPV runway 18 approach into Lawrenceville were 3/4 mile and 200. Ryan received an IFR clearance at 0607 Zulu. He contacted Terre Haute Low Frequency in the climb to 2,600 feet 5 minutes later. The controller asked if Ryan had the weather and NOTAMs for Lawrenceville and if he was requesting the GPS runway 18 approach. Ryan replied that he was. Given the workload of taxiing, getting a takeoff clearance, climbing, contacting ATC, and preparing for a GPS approach, it seems reasonable to assume that when Ryan stated that he had the weather and NOTAMs, he was referring to the weather packet that he received from ForeFlight 20 minutes prior to takeoff. If this slightly dated information was what Ryan was going on, he would have expected to break out early on the approach, having the runway or ground in sight well above minimums. He was, in other words, expecting weather similar to what he had encountered in Sullivan. November 607 Sierra Romeo was a 2007 SR22 with a 310 horsepower IO 550N engine. It was installed with Avidyne's Integra primary and navigational display system. The original GPS nav comm head was a legacy Garmin GNS 430W, which was WAAS enabled for low visibility GPS approaches. However, the GNS unit was not able to import flight plans via a tablet app such as ForeFlight, and its user interface is more cumbersome, lacking a touchscreen. Around 12 hours prior to the accident flight, Sarasota Avionics in Tampa had replaced the Garmin unit with an Avidyne IFD 440. Ryan had successfully used the unit to fly a GPS approach into Sullivan. The approach into Lawrenceville was to be a second approach using the new unit. Ryan filed an IFR flight plan from Sullivan to Lawrenceville, which included one en route fix, JEBDU. JEBDU was also an initial approach fix for the GPS runway 18 approach into Lawrenceville. It is important to understand how a unit such as the Avidyne IFD 440 transitions from the en route phase to the approach phase of flight. The units maintain a database of approaches. This makes loading approaches simple. However, there are generally several different fixes a pilot can use to become established on a particular approach. What Ryan undoubtedly wanted to do was to program the unit to automatically transition from JEBDU onto the approach. What he almost certainly did instead was to select vectors as the approach transition. This tells the GPS nav unit that the pilot is expecting ATC to vector the aircraft onto the approach, which means that the unit will not automatically capture the final approach course. The blue line represents the ground track of November 607 Sierra Romeo. The hatched gray line represents the center line for runway 18. Approaching JEBDU, you can see that November 607 Sierra Romeo continued in a straight line instead of turning towards the runway. This lasted for approximately 20 seconds. The aircraft never did regain centerline on the approach. This is the IFD 540. I'm using it for this portion instead of the 440 because it has a larger screen. Other than the size of the screen, there is no significant difference between the 540 and the 440. I am using the Avidyne iPad simulator to recreate the route from the accident flight. It came with software version 10.3.2, which is a more recent version than Ryan would have had access to that night. In this version, you can see an alert indicating a gap in the route, which means that there is a discontinuity between the JEBDO that was inserted as an en route fix and the JEBDO that was an approach fix. This is what would have occurred as a result of selecting vectors while programming the approach instead of selecting JEBDO as the initial approach fix. Once reaching JEBDO in this scenario, the aircraft would have continued straight instead of establishing itself on the approach. 20 seconds of this is about the amount of time that the majority of pilots would take to recognize that something was wrong and then intervene. And this is what would have happened had JEBDO been selected instead of vectors. You can see the aircraft would just simply turn on course and head in towards the airport. This is a Garmin G1000 version. It's the one that comes with Microsoft Flight Simulator. It works more or less the same as the IFD 440. This depicts crossing JEBDO with the discontinuity, continuing out for about 20 seconds, then reverting to heading mode and turning back towards the center line. Similar to what the ADS-B data depicts from the accident flight, I also quickly selected vertical speed to initiate a descent to the crossing altitude at Lumpke, 2,100 feet. I'm speculating here, but I activate the approach after turning inbound, which syncs up the course needle on the PFD. Crossing Lumpke, I select vertical speed again to initiate a descent. If the approach had been armed, the flight director would have captured runway centerline in the glide path. It doesn't appear that that happened in this case. I also suspect that the autopilot was turned off at some point. I go into quite a bit more detail in the booklet 22 Miles When Good People Make Bad Decisions. You can find that on Amazon for $2.99. I've dropped a link below if you're interested. The end result was that the aircraft descended under control until it impacted trees 1.5 miles short of runway 18. Like and follow if you want more of these videos. Until next time, be safe.